We're counting down 25 forgotten poor man one-pot meals that fed American families through the hardest times this country ever knew. Dishes born in Depression kitchens, Dust Bowl shacks, and wartime pantries. Meals that stretched a nickel's worth of beans into supper for 8. From stews that simmered all afternoon on a coal stove to soups thickened with nothing but flour and hope. Each one tells a story of survival, thrift, and the quiet genius of mothers who refuse to let anyone leave the table hungry. Expect cheap cuts, humble beans, and flavors forged in years when a single ham bone had to last a week. Which forgotten meal tops our list? Let's begin the countdown with number 25. Number 25. Cabbage soup simmered on back burners across America whenever winter emptied the garden and the pantry ran thin. Housewives bought a whole head of cabbage for a nickel, shredded it into a pot with an onion, a can of tomatoes, and whatever bones the butcher would spare, then let it bubble low until the kitchen turned warm and fragrant. In the depths of the Depression, a pot like this fed a family for 2 days and cost less than a dime. The smell, sweet, earthy, faintly sharp, told children supper was coming even on the leanest nights. Mothers stretched it further with a handful of rice or a heel of stale bread crumbled in. Fathers came in from the job line with cold hands, grateful for anything hot. It was never fancy, never celebrated, but cabbage soup kept hunger from the door when almost nothing else could. Number 24. Corn chowder carried families through late summer and lean autumn, when sweet corn was cheap and everything else was dear. Housewives cut kernels from a dozen ears, scraped the milky cobs clean, and simmered them with diced potato, an onion, and a little salt pork if the household could spare it. A splash of milk near the end turned the pot creamy and pale gold, and the sweetness of the corn did the work that meat could not. Children hovered by the stove as the chowder thickened, the smell of it filling small kitchens on cooling evenings. Farm families along the Corn Belt lived on it through harvest, when there was labor to feed and little money to do it with. A single ear cost a penny at a roadside stand. Diaries from the era recall the simple joy of a bowl scraped clean. Proof that thrift and comfort could share the same spoon. Number 23. The poor man's meal was the plainest supper in the Depression cookbook, and one of the most common. Housewives fried a few potatoes and a sliced onion in a little bacon grease until the edges browned, then dropped in a chopped-up frankfurter, the cheapest meat on the shelf at around a dime a package, and let it all crisp together in one skillet. That was dinner, starchy, salty, and just filling enough. The sizzle of potatoes in hot fat was the sound of the whole neighborhood at 6 o'clock. Children learned to eat what was in front of them, and there was rarely a scrap left. It appeared in ration-tight kitchens from the coal towns of Pennsylvania to the migrant camps of California. Nobody wrote it in a fancy cookbook because everybody already knew it. It asked for almost nothing and gave back a hot plate, which in those years was everything. Number 22. Creamed chipped beef on toast, known to a generation of soldiers by a cruder name, SOS, turned a few cents of dried beef into a meal that stuck to the ribs. Housewives soaked the salty, paper-thin beef to draw out the sting, then stirred it into a white gravy of flour, butter, and milk, and ladled the lot over toasted bread. A jar of dried beef cost little and kept forever in the cupboard, which made it a workhorse through the Depression and both World Wars. The gravy was rich and peppery, the beef chewy and savory, and a single small jar could feed a family if the gravy was stretched thin enough. Servicemen groaned about it in mess halls, but at home it was comfort. Mothers made it on payday eve nights when the money was gone. But the milk hadn't spoiled. It filled bellies, and it filled them cheap. Number 21. Succotash stretched back to the Native American kitchens that first taught it, but in hard times it became a survival staple in nearly every farm household. Housewives simmered dried lima or shell beans together with corn cut fresh from the cob, bound with a knob of butter and a little of the bean water until it turned silky. The two crops grew side by side in the garden and cost nothing but the labor of picking. In the Dust Bowl years, when the fields blew away and money vanished, succotash was one of the few dishes a family could raise, cook, and eat entirely from their own dirt. The colors alone, golden corn and pale green beans, brightened a gray table. Children shoveled it down without complaint. Diaries recall it served week after week through the growing season, a quiet reminder that the land, even when it failed, sometimes still gave enough to get by. Number 20. Potato soup was the meal families reached for when the money ran out before the week did. Housewives peeled and cubed whatever potatoes were left in the bin, boiled them soft with an onion, then mashed some against the side of the pot to thicken the broth, and stirred in a little milk and a scrape of butter. It cost pennies and could be made from almost nothing, which is why it fed so many through the worst of the 30s. The steam rose thick and starchy, fogging the window over the sink. Children crumbled crackers or day-old bread into their bowls to make it go further. A dusting of pepper or a few snipped chives from the garden was luxury enough. Oral histories from Depression childhoods returned to it again and again. The white, creamy, filling soup that meant whatever else was wrong, at least tonight, nobody went to bed hungry. Number 19. Boston baked beans, slow cooked in the oven all day, filling the house with the smell of molasses and salt pork while they turned soft and dark. Housewives soaked navy beans overnight, then baked them low and slow with a strip of fatty pork, a spoonful of molasses, and a little mustard until the sauce thickened around them. Beans were among the cheapest calories in America, a few cents a pound dried, and a single pot could feed a big family for days. New England households baked them Saturday to eat cold on Sunday, a habit older than the Depression that carried families straight through it. The sweet, smoky beans were served over bread, beside brown bread, or spooned cold from the crock at midnight. Children fought over the crusty, caramelized beans at the top. Cheap, nourishing, and endlessly patient on the back of the stove. They were thrift you could taste. Number 18. Beef and barley stew turned the toughest, cheapest cut in the butcher's case into an afternoon of comfort. Housewives browned a little chuck or shin, meat too sinewy to roast, and then simmered it for hours with barley, an onion, a carrot or two, and plenty of water, until the grain swelled and the broth turned thick and glossy. Barley cost next to nothing, and doubled the pot without a scrap of extra meat. The slow bubble of it on the stove promised a hot supper at the end of a cold day. Children pulled apart the softened beef, and the barley stuck to every spoon. Northern families leaned on it through the long, hard winters of the Depression, when heat came from the same stove that cooked the food. It asked for patience and pennies, and gave back a bowl dense enough to keep a working man going through the next shift. Number 17. Cowboy beans carried the flavor of the open range into hard times kitchens across the West and Southwest. On the old chuck wagons, cooks had simmered pinto beans all day over a fire with salt pork, dried chilies, and a little molasses. And when the ranch work dried up in the 30s, families kept the pot going in their own kitchens. Beans were cheap, filling, and forgiving. A pound stretched across a whole family with room to spare. The smell of them cooking down, smoky and spiced, hung over farmyards and back porches. Children ate them ladled over cornbread that soaked up the thick liquor at the bottom of the pot. A little bacon grease or a ham bone made them richer, but they held their own on beans and water alone. Rugged, warming, and endlessly cheap, cowboy beans fed the men who worked the land long after the wages stopped coming. Number 16. The New England boiled dinner stretched a single cheap joint of meat into a whole table of food in one pot. Housewives took a piece of corned beef or salt pork, the least expensive meat at the counter, and simmered it slowly with cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and turnips until everything turned tender and soaked up the salty, meaty broth. One pot, one fire, one afternoon, and supper served itself. The vegetables came cheap from the root cellar and the garden, and the meat, though small, flavored all of it. Steam rolled off the pot as the lid came away, and the smell of cabbage and brine filled the house. Families ate the meat that night and turned the leftovers into hash the next morning, wasting nothing. Through hard winters when fresh food was scarce and money scarcer, the boiled dinner was proof that a little meat and a lot of patience could still fill every plate. Number 15. Fried cabbage and sausage sizzled in skillets wherever a few cents had to become a meal. Housewives chopped a whole cabbage cheap from the market, fried it down in a little grease until the edges caramelized and sweetened, then stirred in a length of cut-up sausage or a handful of leftover scraps to carry the flavor through. The cabbage did the filling. The meat did the seasoning. A little went a long way. The pan hissed and popped, and the smell, buttery, savory, and faintly sweet, pulled children to the kitchen door. Immigrant families across the industrial North leaned on it hard through the Depression, when cabbage was one of the few vegetables a poor household could always afford. It came together in minutes on a single burner, a mercy when the coal for the stove cost money too. Humble as it was, a hot skillet of it turned a bare cupboard into a proper supper. Number 14. Hoppin'. John carried the taste of the rural South through slavery, Reconstruction, and the Depression alike. Housewives simmered black-eyed peas with rice and a scrap of salt pork or a ham hock until the whole pot turned savory and soft. The peas grew easily in poor soil, the rice stretched them, and the small piece of pork flavored far more than it should have. Cheap and nourishing, it fed sharecropping families for whom every other dollar was already spoken for. Served on New Year's Day, it was said to bring luck and money in the year to come, a hope not lost on households that had neither. The smell of it, smoky and earthy, drifted through cabins and city kitchens alike. Children ate it with cornbread and a mess of greens on the side. More than a meal, Hoppin' John was heritage in a pot, resilience passed down one spoonful at a time. Number 13. Brunswick stew crowded a single kettle with whatever a Southern family could find and turned it into a feast. Traditionally, it began with small game, squirrel, rabbit, or later chicken, simmered slow with corn, lima beans, tomatoes, and potatoes until the meat fell to shreds and thickened the whole pot. In lean years, a hunter's morning could feed the family for 2 days if the stew was stretched with enough vegetables from the garden. It cooked for hours over a low fire, often outdoors, in a great iron pot at church gatherings and community suppers. The smell drew neighbors from down the road. Everyone argued over whose recipe was right and what belonged in it. Children were handed bowls thick enough to stand a spoon in. Born of necessity and cooked in company, Brunswick stew proved that even in the hardest seasons, the South could gather around a pot and call it plenty. Number 12. Kentucky burgoo took the same spirit and made it grander, a great communal stew that could feed a whole town. In the hills and river valleys, cooks filled iron cauldrons with several meats at once, often whatever was cheapest or hunted, then added corn, beans, potatoes, cabbage, and tomatoes, and stirred the mixture for the better part of a day. Burgoo was the food of gatherings, political rallies, church picnics, and county fairs. where one enormous pot stretched a little meat across hundreds of hungry people. The smell hung over the fairgrounds for hours. Families brought bowls from home and lined up with the rest. In hard times, a burgoo could be built almost entirely from donations and scraps. A whole community pooling what little it had into something that fed everyone. It was thrift made social, generosity made edible, and proof that a crowd could eat well on almost nothing. Number 11. Navy bean soup was the plain, patient soup that fed America's poor for generations. Housewives soaked a bag of small white beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with an onion and a ham bone saved from a long-gone Sunday dinner until the beans broke down and thickened the broth on their own. A pound of dried beans cost a few cents and made enough soup to feed a family twice over. It was the definition of stretching almost nothing. A bone that had already given its meat, coaxed into flavoring one more meal. The kitchen filled with the smoky, savory smell as it cooked down. Children mashed the soft beans against the roof of their mouths and sopped the bowl with bread. Through bread lines and ration books, Navy bean soup was always there, cheap and dependable. Nothing about it was grand, but few dishes did more to keep hunger at bay. Number 10. Split pea soup with a ham bone was the thrifty cook's masterpiece of getting something from nothing. Housewives set dried split peas to simmer with a ham bone, an onion, and a carrot, and let them cook down for hours until the peas dissolved entirely into a thick green pottage. The bone, stripped nearly clean already, gave up its last smoky richness to the pot. A bag of peas cost pennies. The bone was free, left from a ham the family had eaten days before. The soup grew so thick a spoon could nearly stand in it. Its earthy, salty smell seeped into the walls and lingered long after supper. Children dunked bread. Parents portioned it carefully to last another day. In an age when a single ham had to feed a household in a dozen small ways, split pea soup was the final, frugal chapter, the meal made from the leftovers of leftovers. Number 9. American goulash bore little resemblance to its Hungarian namesake, but it fed Depression families better than either. Housewives browned a little ground beef, the cheapest meat by the pound, then stirred in canned tomatoes, an onion, and a pot of elbow macaroni, and let it all simmer into a thick, savory tangle. The pasta stretched a half-pound of meat into supper for 6, and the tomatoes tied it together. It cost little and cooked in one pot, which is why it turned up on kitchen tables from Ohio to Texas week after week. The smell of tomato and beef filled small apartments and farmhouse kitchens alike. Children loved the soft noodles and asked for seconds even when there were none. Easy, cheap, and endlessly forgiving of whatever scraps went into it, American goulash became the quiet backbone of the weeknight table, a dish nearly every hard-up family knew by heart. Number 8. Red beans and rice was the Monday night ritual of New Orleans and the rural South, born of thrift and wash day. Housewives set a pot of red beans to simmer with a ham bone from Sunday's dinner while they scrubbed the week's laundry, letting the pot tend itself for hours until the beans turned creamy and thick. Served over a mound of cheap rice, it fed a family for a fraction of what meat alone would cost. The beans grew soft and rich, the bone gave up its smoke, and a little seasoning turned frugality into something worth waiting for. The smell filled whole neighborhoods on Mondays, a shared rhythm across countless kitchens. Children ate it heaped over rice that soaked up every drop of the gravy. Through hard years, red beans and rice was more than economy. It was ceremony, a dependable comfort that arrived at the same hour every week, no matter how thin the wallet. Number 7. Garden vegetable soup, sometimes just called everything soup, was the pot that swallowed whatever the day had left over and turned it into supper. Housewives filled a kettle with water and a bone or a bouillon cube, then added whatever the garden gave and the icebox held. A wilting carrot, half an onion, a handful of beans, the ends of yesterday's vegetables, a few potatoes to give it body. Nothing was too small or too far gone to go in the pot. It cost almost nothing because it was built from the scraps of other meals. The soup changed shape every time it was made, and no two pots were alike. The smell of it simmering told children that even a bare cupboard could still make dinner. Through the leanest years, this humble, ever-changing soup was the ultimate expression of make-do, proof that with a pot, a fire, and a little imagination, hunger could always be answered. Number 6. Chili con carne stretched a small amount of cheap meat across a whole family with the help of beans and spice. Housewives browned a little ground beef or tough stew meat, then simmered it long and slow with beans, tomatoes, onions, and enough chili powder to warm the coldest night. The beans did most of the filling. The spice did most of the flavoring. The meat was almost an afterthought. A big pot cost little and only got better the second day. Across Texas and the Southwest, it began as chuck wagon and cantina food and spread north through the Depression as families discovered how far a bowl of it could go. The smell of cumin and chili filled kitchens and drew everyone to the table. Children crumbled crackers or cornbread into their bowls. Hearty, warming, and cheap enough to feed a crowd, chili turned a handful of ingredients into a meal that satisfied like a feast. Number 5. Hobo stew, the same great communal pot the tramps called mulligan, simmered in rail yards and Hoovervilles wherever the down-and-out gathered. Around a shared fire, men who rode the rails through the Depression each threw in whatever they had scavenged or begged that day. A potato here, an onion there, a scrap of meat, a can of beans, a handful of foraged greens. No single person could have made a meal, but together the pot fed everyone who sat around it. The stew was different every night and belonged to no one. The smell of it drifting through a shanty town meant supper and welcome for whoever was hungry. It was survival built on sharing. The poorest men in America pooling almost nothing into something that kept them all going. More than a recipe, mulligan stew was a code of the road. Whatever you had went in the pot, and everyone ate. Number 4. Hoover stew took its bitter name from the president many blamed for the hard times, and it fed the shanty towns that bore his name too. In the Hoovervilles that ringed America's cities, families and drifters stretched a few pennies into supper by simmering sliced hot dogs together with canned beans, macaroni, and whatever canned tomatoes or vegetables could be had. Every ingredient was among the cheapest on the shelf, and together they made a filling, savory pot for almost nothing. It cooked over open fires and battered stoves in the makeshift camps where the evicted and unemployed washed up. The name carried anger and irony in equal measure, a joke made by people with little else to laugh about. Yet the stew itself was pure practicality, a way to keep children fed when the country had turned its back. Hoover stew is remembered less for its taste than for what it stood for: endurance in the face of ruin. Number 3. Pinto beans and ham hocks, served with a wedge of cornbread, was the daily bread of the rural and southern poor. Housewives soaked a pot of pintos overnight, then simmered them for hours with a smoky ham hock, a cut so cheap the butcher nearly gave it away, until the beans turned soft and the broth thickened into a rich, savory pot liquor. That liquor, sopped up with cornbread, was as prized as the beans themselves. A pound of beans and a hock could feed a family for 2 days at a cost of mere pennies. The smell of them cooking down filled the house from morning to supper. Children crumbled their cornbread right into the bowl. Through the Depression and long after, beans and cornbread were the meal poor families could always count on. Humble, nourishing, and endlessly repeated, the the quiet foundation that carried whole communities through the leanest of years. Number 2, beef stew anchored the hard times table the way little else could, coaxing tenderness and comfort out of the cheapest meat the butcher sold. Housewives browned a pound of tough chuck, then set it to simmer with potatoes, carrots, onions, and a little flour to thicken the gravy, and let the pot work quietly all afternoon while the cold pressed against the windows. The long, slow cooking did what money couldn't, turning a sinewy cut worth pennies into meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Potatoes gave it body and stretched the meat across every seat at the table. The whole house filled with a deep, savory smell as the gravy reduced and thickened. Children fished for the softest potatoes soaked in juice. Fathers came in from the cold and were handed a steaming bowl. More than a meal, beef stew was warmth itself, the taste of a family holding together through a hard winter. Number 1, and finally, in first place, chicken and dumplings crowned the hard times table as the ultimate comfort a poor kitchen could offer. When a laying hen finally stopped laying, it went into the pot. A tough old bird stewed for hours until the meat surrendered and the broth turned golden and rich. Then came the magic that made it a feast. Spoonfuls of simple dough, nothing but flour, fat, and a little liquid dropped onto the bubbling surface to swell into soft, pillowy dumplings that soaked up the broth. One old hen and a few cents of flour became a meal that felt like a celebration. The smell filled the house on Sunday afternoons, and children pressed close to the stove waiting for the lid to lift. Mothers ladled out the steaming dumplings with a sense of ceremony. In the leanest years, this was the dish that meant everything was, for one evening, going to be all right. The taste of comfort conjured against all odds from a spent hen and a handful of flour. The last spoonful was always a promise that no matter how hard the times, a warm pot and a full table could still bring a family together. Across all 25 meals, from that humble pot of cabbage soup to the triumphant chicken and dumplings at the very top, these forgotten dishes tell one powerful story: survival, thrift, and the stubborn ingenuity of families who fed themselves on almost nothing. Beans and bones, cheap cuts, and garden scraps recur in nearly every entry, a reminder of how necessity shaped the American table. They were more than recipes. They were the taste of a generation that endured the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the war, stretched every penny, wasted nothing, and against the odds still found warmth around the family table.